Learning to become, learning to learn, learning to thrive, learning to flourish, learning to care.
It is now time to listen to our voices.
To prepare a better future.
Treat others and
the planet as you would wish to be treated.
Collaborating
and develop in partnership. We have the capacity
to understand,
to take action,
to take care of ourselves, others, and the planet.
And we want to invite you
to really work together
and collaborate so that we can have an impact now.
Welcome to Learning Planet Festival.
It can just get better.
Hello, everybody. My name's Alan Bolden. I'm the Managing Director of Dartington Trust in the UK and the Founder Director of Weave. So welcome, everybody. We live in a time of climate crisis, mass biodiversity loss, obscene inequality and inequity, and during a pandemic. Yet our education systems are focused on a narrow and arguably outdated idea of the economy and jobs market. The Learning Planet Festival invites us to reimagine learning in service of people and planet. In many of our systems, we continue to focus on STEM approaches, science, technology, engineering, maths, even when research suggests we need more joined up approaches. Even organizations like Google have said that they're not looking for STEM expertise, but for employees with the capacity for creativity, collaboration, and compassion. I'm not suggesting we ask Google to design our learning systems, but what are we to make of that? We're asked in this panel to think about the value of the intersection between the arts, sciences, and technology, and interdisciplinary forms of engagement and inquiry. But is interdisciplinarity a cure-all? Ken Robinson famously suggested we need to think about the 8 C's: compassion, criticality, collaboration, composure, curiosity, creativity, communication, and citizenship. Are these the qualities we need to nurture? We've got a fantastic panel today to help us think into these questions and no doubt more. I'll shortly ask each panel member to introduce themselves and to speak for 5 minutes about these themes. I'll then chair a discussion and we'll bring in questions from you, the audience. So be prepared to post your questions so that we can open out the debate. So I'm really looking forward to this. I hope you are too. And I'm going to hand over already to Csaba. Over to you. Here we go.
Thank you. My name is Csaba Mányai, and I'm impact architect behind the Community Arts Network, which is an emerging multidisciplinary network with the purpose to kind of help the field tap into the full potential of arts. And we're focused on building an enabling infrastructure and kind of bringing a new type of advocacy to the field, which is really not along the lines of standing on the street corner metaphorically and shouting even louder that arts can be important, rather trying to bring arts as a useful, meaningful, practical tool to other fields, so that if we employ that, other fields and disciplines may experience and see the value of integrating arts in a different way. Our approach really stems from the concept that many of our endeavors, or most of our efforts really to try to make impact and achieve results, follow a very industrial kind of logic or pattern. But what we experienced mostly around us is that results and impact are rather born than manufactured. So they follow rather the logic of an organic process. And we try to kind of bring a new framework to all of these endeavors, because what we see around us, that the grand challenges we face are complex, interconnected, and emergent, while the tools that we have to deal with them customarily are specialized, targeted, and work in silos mostly. And education is a prime example of this. I think that you quoted Ken Robinson. He talked about the whole idea of how we could look at education as an ecosystem, and how we have to rethink the question that was originally posed in the industrial era, and how we use education basically as a manufacturing tool, even if we refined it and fine-tuned it in many ways. But we're not necessarily asking the question, what are we preparing ourselves for through education, and whether the world that we're preparing ourselves for is similar at its core than when our current concept of education was born. The way we really see this, that if we are facing such interconnected grand challenges that follow a different pattern than our tools, then arts may have a very important responsibility and opportunity and a key role in making this qualitative transformation, transcending those boundaries, because art's power really resides exactly in those elements to help us exercise moral imagination, of reconciling opposites, connecting through boundaries. All of these things are inherent in art's unique approach. And one of the key challenges that we think is, how can we tap into these unique qualities, what art's way of engaging with the world and ourselves can bring. We're absolutely not saying that arts in itself could be a substitute for all the other important dimensions. But I think it is really key and important that we integrate smartly what arts can bring to the table. And in this way, together, we could actually, and arts in that sense could be a missing piece in that whole ensemble of tools and approaches that we use to drive learning and development. And finally, in this way, I think we can and should move beyond the idea regarding arts as well. And I know it's a big subject of talking about subjects and classes and classrooms in education, but I think it is the same for arts, that we can move beyond the idea that we have arts in education as a subject of learning, and we can think and explore towards arts being a medium of learning, exploration, connecting, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it, what I wanted to say as introduction, and really looking forward to hearing you guys. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Csaba. Just a quick comment from me. I think in the preparation for this session, we talked about, well, I mentioned that I once was advising an impact investment group, and they said to me, how do we design an ecosystem? And I said, well, I think that there's a bit of hubris there. I'm not sure you can design an ecosystem. But I think, in our conversation, maybe we can get into that later. We talked about what might be the features of enabling infrastructure, maybe that can encourage emergence. But maybe we can return to that. Did you want to just briefly come back in?
Yeah, I think that it's not necessary. You cannot manufacture an ecosystem, but you can put some things in place. Think of a garden, for example, that you cannot really manufacture and design the tree, but you can design a lot of things. You can design for fertile soil, you can sow the seeds, nurture growth, integrate all that. So I know it's a complex question, yeah.
Yeah, but I think those images are very helpful, maybe for us to just hold in mind as we get into the discussion. So, but that was great. Thanks very much, Csaba. Jeff, I'd like to bring you in now. Over to you.
Hi there. Yeah, so my name's Jeff Mulgan. I'm currently a professor at a university and a background in various things, including schools and government and civil society. And I guess I've always thought there was a bit of a problem that our education was individual, passive, siloed, non-creative. We probably all agree with that. And what I thought I'd do very briefly, mention sort of 5 things, 30 seconds each, which might be part of what needs to happen. I thought I'd use a mobile phone as the little prompt for this thing which most children now have, and they're sort of banned from the classroom. But I think the mobile phone can be a really useful tool for thinking about the things we need to think about. So first of all, I actually still believe we need depth of knowledge in education, depth of knowledge of the physics which lies behind these sort of things, but also depth of knowledge of the history. It was in fact telecommunications which paved the way for the United Nations and all global collaboration. The fact you can call from here to the other side of the world rests on all sorts of standards and governance which most people haven't a clue about. And of course, you can also use your phone to get depth of knowledge of things like the history of art. And for me, the fascinating thing I think everyone should learn is how art taught us repeatedly how you combine consonance and dissonance, order and chaos in new ways. Maybe we might come back to that. Secondly, I think anyone now needs to know knowledge about knowledge. Now, some of that is kind of obvious, the way that Finland now teaches school kids how to spot fake news. We need to break out of our own echo chambers wherever we are and understand the nature of the knowledge we have. And anyone looking at the history of science realizes the vital importance of the arts and creativity in shaping how scientists saw things and thought that often new forms of observation through microscopes and telescopes and X-rays preceded the scientific discovery. So it's crazy to see these as separate domains. Thirdly, I would love to see an education which put more emphasis on wisdom. And there are obviously many aspects to this. There's learning how to have an ethical take on anything you do in your own life or your politics or so on. Again, there's seeing things in the round through multiple perspectives. So as I said, looking at a mobile phone through its economics, its sociology, its politics, its technology, and not just the TikTok you can use it for. These are useful tools. And above all, I think getting the habit of what I call learning loops, where we look at our own predictions of what we think might happen, notice what actually happens, and then learn from that. And the problem is even very clever, very progressive people tend to find confirming facts in the world. We're all very bad at challenging our own assumptions. And I think that is the key to true wisdom, is challenging our own deep beliefs. And then, as Csaba said, systems. We live in a world of systems. This is a total system, but so is our ecosystem, our biosphere. And so we have to learn fairly early on how to think systemically and how one thing influences another. And finally, this thing is a fantastic tool for doing stuff. I think we learn a lot about the world through practical projects in teams, which can start in primary school, certainly secondary school, even more universities, working together on things like improving air quality in your neighborhood, working on the SDGs, perhaps sorting out the fake news in your own community as COVID and anti-vaxxers go crazy. And this is the most powerful tool ever in history to mobilize people, to find allies, form coalitions, run campaigns, and so on. So this bit of machinery, which often we see as mindless and a problem, I think can be a route into all the ways our learning systems and our learning habits need to change to cope with the incredible problems we have up ahead. And of course, the last 10 months of COVID have forced us to be much more dependent on these things, but we need to perhaps recover their radical potential.
That's great, Jeff. Thanks very much. I'm really curious to get into discussion there as well. We will come back to a lot of that. You mentioned Finland, and where the school system is to a large extent moving away from subjects and really focusing on project-based learning. I'm very interested in project-based learning, place-based learning as well. I'm curious to discuss how that can be combined with the kind of depth of knowledge that you're looking for. I think that's a critical question. We're talking about interdisciplinarity. Sometimes that can look as if we might skate over the subjects that we're engaging with rather than moving towards that depth. So it'd be interesting to come back to that. And certainly interested to hear more about what you mean by wisdom. My company, Weave, one of the things we say we're focused on is nurturing systemic wisdom. We're trying to work out what we mean by that. It'd be great to hear your thoughts. Great, that's a great start. Okay, so moving on, can I ask Gediminas, could you bring us your thoughts? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gediminas Orbones. Together with...
Can't hear you at the moment, Gediminas.
Oh, hello. Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Not sure, yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gediminas Urbonas. Together with my partner, Nomeda, we have joint artistic practice based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we work at MIT. In our work, we often engage scientists and experts from other fields. We are interested in art that works as a catalyzer for a dialogue between diverse fields of knowledge production. We raise questions about the role of art and its capacity to destabilize logic of science and suggest an alternative imagination. It is essential to rethink and reconsider themes that may sound already resolved, raise irritant questions, and interrogate uncanny matters. One of such irritant and uncanny topics for us is a swamp. Swamp is often compared with a hell. Drain the swamp is a slogan that comes from political rhetoric. However, if we take a risk and dive into a swamp, we realize that swamp is more than just a metaphor that signifies uncivilized mud or mess. Swamp unfolds as perfectly organized biosphere, as a habitat of diverse knowledges with its own stack of historic, cultural, cybernetic ontologies. It is a multifaceted model for which we can look at the complexities of our planet, at relations between living and modern living beings, and realize that swamp is an interface of Gaia. Such articulation of a swamp relates to a critical zone concept suggested by a French philosopher, Bruno Latour, and investigated at the exhibition with the same name at ZKM Art and Media Center in Karlsruhe, Germany. That's now been closed for COVID, but I hope this will soon open again. Swamp is a critical zone and is understood as an endangered ecosystem that reached a critical point, as well as a critical position of the swamp researcher in regards to resource depletion and exhaustion of the environment. Humans drain swamps and extracted peat without understanding that swamps are most productive sink of carbon and methane, even 3 times surpassing capacity of rainforest or ocean algae. Scientific studies on the economic value of ecosystems identify the wetlands as the most valuable compared to lakes, forests, rivers, or oceans. Wetlands are kidneys of the planet. They collect and distribute water, filter pollutants in the environment, serve as habitats for plants and animals, as well as refuge, and historically we know also refuge for people, and also they are object for scientific and even artistic research. Our swamp research combines scientific knowledge and artistic vision. Through the Swamp School, we develop tools that invite participants to learn from the swamp through sensory experience and thus experience so-called hybrid knowledge or other ways of knowing the world. Here we raise questions about what cities, materials, technologies of the future could be and what pedagogy should be developed to meet the challenges of the future climate. With the ongoing climate change and rising water levels, when oceans sink larger areas of land, we argue that the question is to not how preserve our cities by building barriers or walls, and not how to adapt, but how to imagine a different climate. Expansions of human settlements, industrial revolutions, and modernity did their best to drain swamps. Along with the swamps, other knowledges were eliminated, the so-called indigenous epistemologies. Therefore, the Swamp School proposed a concept of amphibious pedagogy, which would help to learn from the hybridity of the swamps, from coexistence with other forms of thinking, to learn sympoetics and making world together.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gediminas.
That was my opening. Yeah.
Well, that raises a huge amount of questions. I have to admit I lost you for a couple of minutes at the start, but I think we've talked often enough. I know your practice very well. I'm curious, when we get into discussion, there have been a number of comments about the role of artists and what you might say about that. And in fact, what your brief presentation has, what questions that's given rise to in the other panel members. Just a brief comment from me. certainly in conversation with Cree and the hosts, I think there's been a lot of discussion about empathy as one of the big questions. How do we, again, nurture or develop empathy in learners? And I think your practice asks us to inhabit other species. And I do think there's an interesting question there about whether that's a route to empathy, trying to inhabit the world of others, including even the world of other species in your work. So,
yeah. Or also acquire cannibalist metaphysics and look for the other eyes of other species.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, great. Well, I'm sure we're going to fold back to those very questions. So just in the spirit of getting to the open debate, I'll move us on. Ange, can I ask you to introduce yourself and bring your thoughts into the discussion?
Thank you. Hi, Ange Ansour. I co-founded Saventurier École de la Recherche along with François Tadei, the CRI director, and I currently direct Saventurier. What is Saventurier? It's a French educational program that we created back in 2013 in order to tackle not only the French educational system problems, but to rethink education in a novel way. We promote by experimenting and developing a educational paradigm that we call education through research. Our aim is to introduce young people from kindergarten to high school, whether in school or during extracurricular activities, to the methods, the ethics, the ways that scientific research works. That means we want young people to understand how humankind produces knowledge, how this knowledge gets validated, and how does it circulate. You know, I feel like everybody is stuck between this duality between fake news and, you know, true news, and we cannot get out of it. So we wanted to go even further back and to enable each kid, when they have even their most ordinary, you know, usual everyday stuff at school, their textbooks, for instance. Why do I use these textbooks? What's their status in the knowledge system? So it's the translation of the human knowledge in a scholarly way. So why we want that? How do we operate on an everyday basis? So we propose projects for kids. What is interesting is that we understand science as not being only, you know, about astrophysics or biology or whatsoever. It can be mainly human and social sciences also. And the idea is to make kids run and operate genuine research projects within their classes. I'll just give you a very small example. One of the last projects that was run by the teachers and a scientific mentors with 7, 8, and 9 years old kids during the lockdown. So they were wondering how to help, blind kids in schools, and they invented a connected shoe that they called chouchou, that means cutie in French. And this shoes that will enable the kid to not only to go through the corridors and find the classroom, but also mainly to play with other kids without getting hurt. So, and the thing is that these kids won one of the most, known prizes from the Fondation Saint-Pierre, that is primarily won by, researchers and startups, and their prototype won this, this competition. Why it's important to make these kids, all the kids, go through an once in a lifetime research experience. We do not really aim them to be all becoming researchers. It's only about making them more creative in a rigorous way, in a robust way, so they can, tackle mainly the Anthropocene challenges. Because we were wondering, how can you not only fix the mess, but only how to make a future desirable? How can you combine intelligence and goodwill? How can you transform this need for scientific truth in a matter of seeking justice? How kids can, through developing their own creativity, their own way of having critical thinking, collaborating, have both, what we call this both aims, going to this, seeking this scientific truth and looking for a more fair world. So this is what we do on an everyday basis. We've been helpful, I hope anyway, to dozens of thousands of kids and teachers all along. And we may discuss it even further afterwards. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ange. And just, if I may, just bring in a little bit of our conversation from the other day, because I think it may relate to one of the points Jeff was making about depth. I think we talked about, if we are trying to reimagine learning, we have to be careful not to casually dismiss thousands of years of pedagogy and disciplinary expertise. So somehow, how we can combine that, as well as imagine new forms of collaboration and hybrid ways of knowing. And I think, Csaba, we've talked about a kind of humbleness required to draw on multiple ways of knowing. So again, these might be themes that we want to come back to. But thanks very much, Ange. Okay, great. Megan, can I ask you to join the conversation and bring your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you so much, Alan. I'm Megan Fallon, and I am the former CEO of the Barefoot College International and now a board director and the founder of a company called Step Up, which works on systems change design in the social innovation space, and particularly in working with social entrepreneurs to help them use design to architect partnerships that lead to really strong outcomes and a changed system. And I suppose I feel strongly that we are living in a really strange world at the moment, the middle of a transformation, and that our perceptions of equality are really broken. One size fits all in education is not going to work any longer, and we have to be able to accept a certain amount of complexity, and indeed to look at how that can offer opportunities for growth and opportunities for convergence between all of these disciplines that we all know are essential to developing human beings that have strong empathy, strong innovation, and strong critical thinking skills, because that's really what our children need now. They need to be able to learn at Mach speed. And our adults living in adversity, who are in the developing world most particularly, need that same skill. And I think we too often forget that 40% of our population lives in a very, very different situation than we do. And so I thought probably it's easiest for me to show you what I've been working on, which is pretty incredible. So we have, I'm just trying to share my screen here for a moment. There we go. So we've been doing something really unique. We have been looking at ways to transform education and our ideas of education by choosing the least likely person to possibly do the most extraordinary thing. These are illiterate and semi-literate women from all over the developing world learning to become solar engineers. And that's not a light skill. That's 196 pieces built on a circuit board, and they're able to do it in 45 minutes. Why? Because this is unfortunately what most of them see at home every day. Their children learning to learn with really poor quality light. And so we looked at how do we design a solution for that problem and for the problem of economic, enabling economic activity in the poorest communities. So clean light was the first way that started, and really looking at how women who were the least likely carriers of that could possibly bring this incredible resource to their communities, but without ever having had a formal education. And that fast-tracked us to starting to use technology to integrate with exactly those same illiterate and semi-literate users. And it turns out that women in these situations learn together. They share technology. They understand that it gives them power. It's this incredible democratic way of empowering another human being in ways that we all take for granted. We've moved that further. We started looking at how we could use household budgeting and critical thinking skills, micro-entrepreneurial skills, and again, to extend those downwards to children. By this convergence of using very, very beautiful technology in really extraordinarily poorly resourced communities, not as a way to just transfer knowledge, but as a way to catalyze discovery, really to engage with pieces of technology in creative ways that give a creative outlook, that create inquisitiveness and discovery and wonder. And I think this is very much a different approach, a little bit of a disruptive approach than we have previously looked at. And so our journey at Barefoot has been largely one of just trying to continually learn, unlearn, relearn, rediscover the possibilities from our learners, and really take a very unconventional approach to defining education in today's setting.
That's great, Megan. Really exciting work. I'm very struck by the phrase catalyzed discovery. And again, we talked a little bit about, well, our shared interest in the work of Tagore and John Dewey as, sort of major thinkers in pedagogy, both interested in learning by doing and a kind of whole approach to learning, head, hand, and heart. And again, might want to bring Jeff in at some, point shortly. Jeff and I talked about assimilating learning and turning events into experience. And I think sometimes there's catalyzing moments. They're kind of like aha moments. They're very exciting, full of energy. And then you have to sort of draw out what that moment was about. And I think you started to go into that as well, Megan, about learn, relearn, and not just in a didactic way, other people learning, but how do we learn? How does the system learn? It'd be really interesting to explore that more.
I think we've moved from a time of the idea that learning was one person to many. And then we moved into a time of many people teaching many, or many people learning from many. And now what we really need to construct and design for is a world in which anybody can learn from anyone. And that means a really different way of thinking about scale and thinking about knowledge transfer.
Yeah, that's great. So the questions are certainly stacking up, I think, for us to start to get into soon. But before we do that, I'd like to bring in Xinwei and hear your thoughts. Xinwei, over to you.
Great, thank you.
Want to say who you are, Xinwei?
Yes, I should say who I am before I start sharing anything, right? So my name is Xinwei, and I'm the director of the Synthesis Center. And for the past 6 years, I was also director of the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering. And before that, I was working in the domain of research creation in Montreal, Canada for about 10 years, with a long interest in combinations between what used to be very separate early education in mathematics, work in activism in California, and then also working with artists and theater people, experimental arts. So after all these years, managed to find some opportunities to make these institutional experiments, making something between a lab, studio, ateliers. So that's what brought me to talk about it. So to be efficient, I'd like to just share some images as I talk, right? If you don't mind, that way we can also go quickly over some points that have been so rich and hopefully resonating with some of the rich points that people have been making. So currently, to come to the present, first of all, make sure that you all can see this. Yes? Yep. Okay, good. So we've been working with the United Nations Development Program on a series of alternate reality simulations to be deployed in Hanoi, Bangkok. You see the cities up on the screen, Mexico City, for example, and Phoenix as well. So the point is to somehow work with United Nations staff and partners, for example, in local governments, national governments, and in NGOs, to see how the UNDP in particular, but also different partners can manage to can move away from conventional ways of making decisions in policy. For example, this idea that we can control a system, that we can actually do linear planning, that we can plan to handle one infrastructure without paying attention to any other infrastructure. We can modularize our work, that we can depend on single point magic bullet solutions, and that we can rely on expertise. when in fact the situations are far more complex than that. So what we're going into is try to think about how to deploy, for example, complex adaptive systems thinking. Some of you have already mentioned that, using, for example, this idea of abduction, making up metrics and measures as we go, or thinking not in terms of control or management, but more thinking in terms of navigation, that the ocean is much bigger than we are, so the best we can do is to navigate. And also thinking in terms of prototyping. How can we try out a few scenarios beforehand? That brings up this issue of knowledge and power, right? Knowledge is power, but what kind of knowledge? So we're thinking, of course, we mentioned before, different kinds of knowledge. Know that, scientific knowledge, know how, art and engineering, technicities, techne, know why, philosophical thinking, but also know when to do something, which could be a matter of ethics or performance and politics. But then there's also this other 99%, what percent of us actually have the privilege of engaging in that kind of practice? What about the rest, 99%? Labor, consumer, or debtor? And this we might think is part of the behind Alan's provocation. There's also politics. These are infernal choices, as Isabel Stenger said. Maybe that's not the only relationship we can have to society, to be a laborer, to worker labor, to be a consumer, or to be a debtor. Okay. Let's go even further back. Newton, 1666. So if you talk about knowledge, modern knowledge, there's this famous experiment that Isaac Newton did, right? He took white light, put it through a prism, and out came all these different colors, the dispersion of light, right? This famous experiment at the beginning of modern science, which I could take as kind of as a stand-in for modern science itself, which is knowledge split into specialties. And then they all are very powerful. We need those specialties. But can we do something in reverse? Can we take these different specialties and expertises and then blend them together, amalgamate them again? And so we can use them in different tinted forms, in different techniques that combine fact and value. So not just matters of fact, right? But also matters of value. So what are some of those techniques? Well, we have names for them already, like sense making, which could be multiplying the senses that are at play, nuancing, nudging. Another one is navigating. Another set would be navigating. For example, attuning, orienting, coordinating. So these are just verbs to try out. Now, what about art? So I teach in arts, right? I teach in arts and design, but certainly in the United States context, one of the issues that we see, some of us see, is that when artists try to be relevant or socially impactful, it can reduce to what I call artsplaining, like a pun on mansplaining, right? The artist makes a statement or an object that comments upon society or what is wrong, what is good with society. So I, as an artist with my big ego, make a statement, right? But is there another way? And it's already been mentioned before, thinking of creative practice as a mode of enabling, right? This word which is very powerful. Where could that come from? Well, Spinoza had this beautiful notion of ethics, which is that brief, this idea that when I have an ethical relationship with the other, the good is that which the good is that which enlarges the other's power of action, the power of action, which is a beautiful way of putting it, right? So can we think of art as an enabling condition, which brings us to thinking about ecologies and infrastructures. Could there be an art of infrastructure, which requires, of course, a huge amount of technicity, engineering, science, but also humility, which I'll just bookmark with Lao Tzu. I'll close with this. And this brings us back to some of the work we've been doing over the last 10, 15 years is to techniques to combine art and technology and computational media to make media responsive, to make environments responsive, so to be able, so that people can gather together and collectively improvise, imagine, prototype, navigate alternatives to that which is the case.
Great, thanks Xinwei. That was excellent and good way to finish the contributions. So thanks everybody. You feel free to unmute, and I'm going to ask you to come into conversation now. Well, Jeff's left already. That's a bad sign. Hopefully he's coming back. I wanted generally just to double check in a way that there's consensus, because it sounds as if everyone on this call is saying that we do need to combine different forms of knowing, that if we are reimagining learning, that interdisciplinarity is potentially an important feature of that reimagining. But I just want to check, are there dissenting voices here or people who would challenge that? Certainly when I heard the comments about depth of knowledge from you, Jeff, I do think that throws up a challenge, and I think Ange talked about that as well. So how do we reimagine learning systems where we can support forms of inquiry that offer that depth, but also insight and breadth of understanding and knowledge? Does anybody want to come in on that? Jeff, you look like you want to come in.
Well, maybe just to start on that. So I think this is the real challenge, is any kind of education has limited attention, limited time, limited resources. So you can't do everything. So how do you combine, as it were, the vertical knowledge and the horizontal putting the pieces together? Now, we are in a society, an economy, which depends on an enormously complicated division of labor, which requires many people to have very, very deep knowledge. You can't understand an energy system or the choices, for energy systems in the next 20 or 30 years without very, very deep knowledge. Being superficial is no help to anyone. So to my mind, it is crucial that we do keep some of the role of education in building deep, and yes, it is disciplinary knowledge, whether it's biology or physics or chemistry or history or economics and so on, and then add on to it these horizontal capabilities of thinking, systemically thinking in interdisciplinary ways, understanding the interactions and dynamics. And the fear is if you just junk the sort of the disciplinary knowledge and try and get everyone straight away to think systems, you just get hot air and bullshit and no one has any impact on anything. I think that's a very practical challenge for secondary schools, for universities, and also for anyone who's trying to work on systems change. How do you get that balance right? Because in the long run, our time and our attention is still the scarce resource. We have infinite information, but sadly, pretty much the same absorptive capacity probably our forebears had 50 years ago, 200 years ago, I think.
Great. Csaba, you look like you want to come in on that.
Adding on to that is that I think there is kind of a fundamental issue about the map of how we think about knowledge. Because if we had a more balanced understanding that we need both, then we could, because some people can navigate towards one end of the spectrum, some can navigate towards the other. But the question is, each of them, can they value what the other can bring, and can they work together? So a specialist can he or she understand the value, what the connector or the systemic thinker can bring, and can he or she value that? And is there already some kind of capability or capacity to connect and work together, and vice versa? So that is, I think, a third meta element that can be introduced into learning, so that everybody has to be exposed to the value of these different approaches. And when we go to teamwork, we have to learn these different roles, and we have to understand how we can work as ecosystem.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a comment in the chat was asking Xinwei if you could expand on sense making. I suppose the reason I wonder if that might be useful at this point is just, if we are trying to draw in other perspectives, other ways of knowing in order to make sense of, to make meaning of, it's those processes that might be that horizontal mapping that Jeff's referring to. Do you want to just say something about that? And then I think Megan wants to come in as well.
So Noah Brinder and some other folks have written about
you're dropping out a bit,
If everything's the same, no matter which way we think, if everything's the same, no matter which way we think or which way we act, then there's no grip, right? We don't have a sense of what's going on. But maybe sense making is the breaking of symmetry, making things not the same. So that's why, for example, when we talk about asymmetries of power or asymmetries of knowledge, when people are gathered together, some are experts and some are not experts, right? Some have spent a lifetime doing something. is there a way, I think in creative work we can, how can we actually leverage those asymmetries? Because that leveraging or that recognition leveraging is already, I think, a way of beginning to make sense. Makes sense. Just that.
Is that a moment you want to come in, Megan?
Sure, but I'm going to end up being the most controversial person on this panel, probably. Oh.
That's setting up a challenge.
So there you go. A wise man once said to me, you know what the definition of an expert is? An ordinary man from another town. And I think this exclusionary mindset about knowledge is something that has really caused us to be in the situation we are today with the lack of participation possible from 40% of the planet's population. We've rarefied education to such a point where even poor people who live in rural settings don't think they deserve that education. I've heard that from women. This is heartbreaking, right? So somehow we have to begin to think about education beyond ourselves, beyond the world we live in, and in a much broader sense. And I actually think that that demands of all of us things like empathy, things like creativity of thought, critical thinking, to be transformed by visual things and to be in touch with the natural world. These are all transdisciplinary kinds of sensitivities, and they have to become the cornerstones of our educational approaches, not the nice to haves as the add-ons. Like, we can't still be having this conversation 10 years from now, because the human beings who we are producing, who need to design and deal with the world that is in front of us right now, are people that must have radical empathy, must be comfortable with proximity of human beings and of nature. And unless we start to imbibe those things in every act of knowledge transfer and in every thought process of how we design our systems of education, we are going to be left without the leadership in 10 years that we need. And I'm really concerned about that. And concerned that we are not putting our money, our resources, and our focus on raising up each of those other pillars to the level and the seriousness that they need to be to develop human beings able to cope in a complex and continually changing and adaptive situation.
Great. I'm not sure which bit of that you thought was going to make you unpopular or challenging, but I suppose I'm curious as well. Seeing the projects that you were talking about and the women that were learning those incredible skills. So the skills are relevant right now, and they're giving employment and opportunities. So there's a yearning for the knowledge, a hunger for that, and I think that's great when that can be part of any learning system. We know that the technology might move on, and suddenly that skill is no longer the one that's required. And what I also got from what you were saying is that there's a kind of meta level to the learning, which is
I don't think it matters, because the thing that's unlocked for the women, the technology is relevant in this moment, has a direct application. But what is really the transformation there is that when you face something you have never imagined, and you are able to master that thing and to interact with it closely and to have power over it in a way. And that's what knowledge does, right? That's what competency does. And it's that balance between knowledge for the sake of knowledge and knowledge for competency and application, practical application. What happens is they learn the most important thing, which is that they can learn. And that's what unlocks them. And that's what leads to the next thing that they want to learn, and the next thing and the next thing. Doesn't matter if those things change along the way, because they've learned to break down a problem, face something they never imagined they could master that thing, and succeed. So, we do a lot of design about how to set them up for that success. And I'm not so sure, and really understanding what are the reasons they might not be successful so that we can preempt those and design around them. If we think about that with our children, do we really design our education systems? That's a question for being able to help them guarantee success and to have that mastery, that sense of mastery? Or do we more often end up with children who are a little different, not quite the same, exactly as you were saying before, this idea about sense making, you know, being something that needs to be adaptive, totally adaptive.
Yeah, great. I mean, I you know, just in shorthand, I think, you know, I got the sense that you were helping people to learn and learn about learning and learn to learn. And I wonder if, Ange, you know, I think we talked a bit about, you know, some people have described that we're in a kind of post-truth world, and I wonder what the place is there of expertise, knowledge-based discipline in sort of re-establishing a, you know, what might be called a healthy relationship to knowledge, meaning making, and uncertainty. And just if I could also mention that Olivier put in the chat that in a session this morning, it said that there was a survey that showed that 1 out of 10 young people aged 15 has the skills needed to make the difference between a factual information and an opinion. Only 1 out of 10. That's a little concerning. Have you got some thoughts on that? You're on mute still there.
Okay, thank you. I think we tend to make kind of artificial oppositions between interdisciplinarity, disciplinarity, the schools working to give some knowledge to the kids or working on soft skills like empathy and so on. I think if you just go into classrooms and live into a classroom, like, you know, being invisible and going for days and weeks on, you would find that the ecosystem of a classroom is much more complex than the thing that we are talking about. I mean, during a school day, so many things happen, intertwining what the kid is learning from a curricular point of view, what he's living through, such as experiences with other kids and stuff like that. So I'm a bit cautious when we say we need to change schools all over and we just have 2 years to do that. Otherwise, it's, you know, it's going to be pandemonium at the end of the world, because there are people working here and we need to respect their professional identity, like as teachers, and they have some skills, and we know we need to accompany them. This is why we talk about education research. We believe that it has 2 pillars. First of all, making these kids going through the experience of transforming their questions, their curiosity into a very robust scientific methodology. And the other pillar is teachers as researchers, teachers as experts. It's not, you know, just executing stuff. So if we make, you know, if we trust teachers and school systems, I'm sure we can go beyond whatever we want. And the second thing, you've been talking a lot about, you know, interdisciplinary approaches, because things tend to be complex and we need to be innovative. I'm not sure that we are at any level innovative. I'm not aware of thousands of years of pedagogical experiences and researches. So I'm very cautious. I think I'm ending up being the controversial one here because I've prepared this book, you know, by Heisenberg, the Nobel Prize, philosophy and physics, and you know, you've got Aristotle, Kant, and all these people were interdisciplinary. I mean, this is not new. But I'm working with small kids. I cannot, you know, balance the phenomenon stuff and say, go for it, you'll be able. No, I need to make them kind of experts in small scale and telling them how to go and dig deeper and deeper and deeper. Because if you want that more than 1 out of 10 or more than 1 out of 15 kids to know to distinguish between what is a fact, what is a knowledge, because a fact is not a knowledge, and what is not a fact and what is imagination. We need them to learn how to get deeper and deeper and dig and to know the roots of things. So this is, I still think that schools have a lot to give, but making them, allowing them to be trusted and to gain more expertise.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just wanted to, because I know in the chat there were a number of people responding to something that Anne Snick put in, which I think is relevant. So I think in your comments there, there's a desire to not carelessly or casually discard expertise, depth of knowledge. At the same time, I think there are concerns that, you know, the way that these approaches become ossified in many education systems to serve an economic model, rather clumsily, even an economic model which may have moved on through automation and other ways. And so, you know, we still have to be careful not to just try and, you know, continue a system which might have some great ideas, some great practices in it, but which somehow is well, as Anne said, we're heading towards ecological disaster and collapse. So something needs to change. I wonder, Jeff, you know, I often talk about the Finnish system where, you know, you might get kids being asked to, in a project-based learning way, asked to build a bridge. You know, they might put some planks over the river and find out that the planks are a little bit too thin to be a bridge. And at some point they're going to think, I need to learn about design. I need to learn about engineering. I need to know what load-bearing capacity is. And they go back hungry for that knowledge so that they can put it to work. I felt like with your comment, you were trying to get at some of that sort of melding of disciplinary expertise, but real world application. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, that's what I've been involved in schools, and I think in universities, where you start with real life problems, like how do we build maybe a circular economy in our city, and break that down into what does that mean for, let's say, fashion or building materials, and then you work backwards from that to pull in the knowledge from the different disciplines. And I think this is the key. You know, our knowledge of ecological disaster almost all comes from science, from incredible capacities through IPCC and others to project the dynamics of climate change. Our only plausible routes to solve it will involve all sorts of changes of mindset, but they'll involve also a lot of very deep knowledge about changing production systems and recycling systems and energy systems, which has to be grounded in depth of knowledge. So it's really important to avoid these false polarities. There's a lot of literature on education, especially perhaps in the US and parts of Europe, which just polarizes. It's either all knowledge and all sort of ramming kids' heads with knowledge. And there's the most popular books actually assert this still, that you can't have any skill without knowledge. And then a mirror view, which says that's all complete rubbish, and sort of dive into purely sort of competency-based approaches. The evidence suggests actually it is both and, not either or. And I guess that's what I'm trying to drive at. So I like to see from really 11 or 12 onwards, every child at the core of the curriculum, not on the side, working on practical projects, which could be looking after a swampland, or it could be working out how to improve air quality in your neighborhood. And through that, bringing in the maths, the communication, the history, the physics, and so on. And then you get an interaction between, as it were, the verticals and the horizontals. But either or doesn't really work, because in a world of 8 billion people, we will need more expertise, not less. And the biggest problems we have of expertise is that the knowledge is not sufficiently reflective or thoughtful, or isn't oriented to understanding purposes and ends and ethics. It's not that we want to row back to a time when, you know, my parents, you know, their time education stopped at 14, 3% of the population went to universities. It's incredibly recent that education of any kind has become universal. So we've got to go forward, not backwards, in my view.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Shinwei, and then Chaba wants to come in, and then I'd like to bring Gediminas as well back in. Shinwei, you're frozen for the minute.
Mike Cooley wrote this wonderful book called Architecture B, where he talked about the millwright, 18th century person who was able to make a water mill. In order to do that, this person was a bit of a carpenter, a bit of a draftsman, a bit of a mathematician, water person, plumbing. So, and this was an amalgam of knowledge, and some of it was quite technical, right? And that's been lost with this modern separation into distinct disciplines. Okay, so it's not that just a shortcut. Yes, we're conditions, but it may take a while to develop a new fusion, a new amalgam. I'm deliberately using these terms: amalgamation, fusing, blending, rather than interdisciplinarity, because we say in the world, in the quote real world outside the academy, there is no discipline. there are bridges and there are towns and there are cities, but there's no discipline, right? In order to build a bridge, in order to build a city, you need everything, all right, all the different kinds of expertises. But there is no
Lost you again a bit there, Chinwe. If I just make a little comment myself, and then bring you in, Csaba. Yeah, I was very influenced a little while ago, and still am, by Hans-Georg Gadamer, who said that when we meet the other, the first thing that happens isn't that we really get to know the other. In the sort of jarring of worldviews, how do they think like that? Why do they hold that view? That actually the first thing that happens is that we have an opportunity to think about how our own worldview has been constructed. So in the lack of match, we can kind of say, well, how did I construct my own worldview? Gadamer talked about all learning, our sense of what was normal, common sense, as well as maybe our postdoctoral research, as prejudices, these prisms, these ways of seeing the world. And he said, when we meet the other, when we meet someone with other worldviews, we can see something about how ours has been put in place. I mentioned it partly because you talked about fusion, Chinwe, and about interdisciplinarity. Often in my work, when I've been trying to facilitate interdisciplinarity, the first thing that happens is that we go back to the depth of our disciplines. And there is great value there. And then we reevaluate what those disciplines are for. And then, as Gadamer says, then perhaps if the other has done the work as well, we can maybe meet each other. And then he says maybe a fusion of horizons is possible, which might be this kind of coming together. And it is an interesting point, I think, to bring you in, Csaba, because we've talked about this, what was the phrase he used, a sort of humble coming together of different ways of knowing. Maybe that's what maybe you're coming in with something else, but curious on your thoughts.
It was the humbleness of multiple ways of knowing, and yes, I really do agree with this point. I just wanted to make another point going back, which is that we often tend to forget about the value of what we already have. Right, and then we tend to focus on bringing in what we're missing, and I think both are important in this sense. And I just wanted to echo Jeff's point that it's not really a debate, an either or kind of thing. The question is, how can we create a better framework for a better balance of these things? And one of the key elements, I think, is this idea that that we can approach something from multiple perspectives that are relevant and important, and we can create a full picture only together. And that goes to this humbleness of multiple ways of knowing, and also really that where we're coming from in education. The idea was that first you have to kind of acquire knowledge without real life application or without applying it. And the kind of world we have now, this is becoming increasingly tiresome and difficult to manage because kids are not willing to really make that stretch and bridging between the two. And what we're kind of lacking, which would be really important, is the drive, the imagination, the agency of bringing all these things together, applying it to problems, and really making use of the potential expertise that we can develop. And I don't think it's really about getting rid of that part. It's really coming to a fuller picture of who we are and what we need to know.
Yeah, I think not getting rid of that part. I think Ange would agree with you on that point. I'm curious about the more than human perspective, and whether you have thoughts on that and how we bring that into the conversation.
Well, one of the main drives for us to engage the swamp and also think of the role of artistic practice, or what we call in cultural filter. And as we know, that swamps are great ecosystems that filtering all kind of polluted and toxic matter. So to think of the swamps as the models, but here the question of pedagogy, is like, or a question of amphibian pedagogy, that is able to navigate in the different terrain, in the water and on the dry land, so to speak. So it speaks about hybridity, but how can we learn from other species? How can we think beyond the human imagination? This is crucial, of course, question as we are basically encountering climate crisis that is of inhumane proportion, right? So we have to already think beyond the human, right? And I think to look. Viveros de Castro is talking about cannibal metaphysics, it's kind of like as a technique to look for the eyes of other species. But I think it is important to deploy this cultural or artistic filter. I cannot really, even with all my capacity and interest and excitement and desire to think as the hedgehog, or to think, from the point of view of the logic of the virus, for example, I yet need a cultural or artistic filter, to understand, the logic, of the jaguar. I need to look at the invisible or logic of the alligator. I need to look at the invisible architecture concept of Juan Downey. At the invisible architecture, as a concept. And through that cultural filter, I may understand, or I may sort of like acquire the logic of the other, and I think, today, we were also discussing about creativity, but I think in this case, it is important to think not only about creativity, but to think about experimentation. I would actually be inclined to put emphasis on experimentation, because that's exactly what art and science have in common. With the goal of experimenting, making new worlds by reconfiguring bits and pieces of existing worlds.
Great, that was very rich, Gediminas. I saw Megan nodding. I wondered if you wanted to come in on experimentation. I know Shinwei wants to come in afterwards. Did you want to comment, Megan? You're on mute there.
That really resonates for me. I mean, of course, I am looking and seeing education from an utterly different perspective from all of you. I'm looking at education as it weighs up for children and women who can't eat tomorrow, who are afraid for their lives, who need knowledge because they are our frontline farmers, smallholder farmers on the ground all over the developing world. And their choices about what they do and how they practice what they do are and must be now informed with exactly the kind of knowledge Jeff refers to, but the social norms that stop them from adopting those kinds of practices or a change in practice have a multitude of negative effects for them. So they operate in a mindset of risk, right? All the time. And so how do we use knowledge transfer to break down those social norms and barriers to allow people to adopt more positive and regenerative behaviors? I mean, so that's sort of my lens, is not where education is something that people can choose to do for the sake of it. These knowledge is something that has to lead to earning, lead to feeding yourself, lead to providing light for yourself, lead to somehow your basic aspirations as a human being. And so it does change the lens quite a bit. And I see that actually they are more open to discovery and in a way much more fearless in the way they learn, because they don't have any of our ideas about being an expert or having a certificate or, and so it's sort of an interesting contradiction, right? That that those communities, how do we help them to move to a different kind of interaction with knowledge and with learning?
Great, thanks, Megan. If I could just bring in a comment again from the audience, because I think it's interesting at this point. So it's more from Anne Snick. I'll just read this one out. Again, the growth of the human population, like that of the economic system, should not be taken as a given fact, but as an issue that we could try to address in a humane way to restore balance with the more than human nature. If wild nature ecosystems collapse, e.g. the sixth extinction event, humanity, as we know, will be threatened as well. Seeing this bigger picture and reflecting on it is what my students experience first as the most daunting, but then as the most empowering aspect of the learning process. And now then says, I'm now probably seen as the most radical voice in the debate. So there's a nice competition going on here about who's going to be the most radical voice. I just as well, wanted to reflect on. I'm part of a journal called Leonardo. It was part, as is Xinwei. We're both on the board. We got a board meeting later. Partly, it was founded by Frank Molina, first rocket scientist, first person to get something to leave the atmosphere. By all accounts, he never thought that this would be put to military application. He was just immersed as a scientist and an engineer in making something happen. When he realized the problems of that, and he was also, facing some challenges because of his political beliefs, he moved to Paris and actually helped set up UNESCO. I think he was the principal scientific advisor. So it's nice to mention him today. But I mention him partly because, and I'd be curious on your thoughts on this, Ange, because I think what your approach is all about is a form of learning by doing in science. I suppose what Frank was really concerned to try and develop through the Leonardo Journal and the kind of work that tries to encourage is this collaboration of science, engineering, tech, but with an ethical base as well. And it was how to bring in that, and Jeff and I talked a bit about this when we're working, what do we acknowledge what we're working on? I think we talked a bit about Aristotle and Aristotle's four causes, and you've also referenced Aristotle, Ange. These kind of ways of thinking that help us to not fall into the habits of, for instance, acting upon the world as if it is inanimate, has no soul. And that maybe leads us to the kind of challenges and problems that we've got on that sixth extinction event. Ange, do you want to speak to that a little bit about ethics and science and learning by doing?
Yes, thank you. Well, in fact, as I was saying at the beginning, as our education program, S'Aventurier, is mainly tackling the issue about education at the Anthropocene era. So I told you about that several years ago. Patrick Bouchon, who's a French historian, during his introductory lesson at Collège de France, asked this question that still is haunting me till today, and I think forever. Why teach unless just to convince young ones that it's never too late for them? So I think if you are talking about learning by doing, experimenting, sciences, social sciences, is really to convince these kids, our kids, that this contradiction between the very slow and long-term time of school and the emotional feelings about the emergency, there is this situation of emergency, the extension, whatever, we should a bit calm down and tell them it's never too late. You've got time to learn, you've got time to experiment, you've got time to think about others. It's not only about climate change or the biodiversity collapse. It's about Anthropocene. It's what kind of social justice for everybody. So I think, it's not just about an opinion. We've got to work towards this. And it's an open question. I do not have all the answers. I think educators all over the world, teachers all over the world are working, trying to grasp kind of, the first ideas about how to tackle this problem. So I think when we talk science, scientific literacy today, when we think about methods, we think profoundly about what kind of citizenship the Anthropocene citizenship could be and not should be. I don't know how should it be, but how could it be?
That's great, Ange, thanks very much. Just to get a brief comment, and I'd love to get Megan, if you want to come back in. But in my work, both at Dartington and with my group weave where we're really looking at how we can sort of connect with and also help establish regenerative learning hubs around the world. And it's partly because we do recognize the need to learn from and with people in very different settings. We might ask similar questions about, what are food security solutions? The strategies, the questions, even the research methods might be similar in each setting. The way the place responds, the context, that will be vital to learn from. So I just wonder, it would be great if we could look at great examples of learning and models of learning around the world, but then how we connect them up is going to be equally important. Do you want to speak to that? I think Barefoot's all about that to an extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, Barefoot is a 48-year-old organization and founded very much on the values and thoughts and principles of Rabindranath Tagore, who we share a great love of. And his philosophy was all based on the discovery, the play, the unlearning of things and ideas, the empathy to sit in the place of the other, and really, can we leave our ego at the door to learn how someone else learns, or what they need to learn and how that's going to work for them. And so I think that's a fascinating thing. We are now present with this program in 93 countries, the Women's Solar Engineering Initiative. And it has been picked up by national governments and has been largely never adopted by an education ministry, weirdly. And I think that's surprising and not surprising both at the same time, but I think it speaks to the need for these innovation hubs and that cross learning that needs to happen, because there's a threat always somehow to an education minister in a developing country who sees a woman who has never been in formal school, who does this quite perceived highly technical thing and manages to manage that piece of technology in a very significant way, and then indeed can have a theoretical discussion because she started with the practical and went to the theory instead of learning the theory and moving to the practical. So now we're starting to trying to work with education ministers to talk about how can we bring these women into a more formal interaction with formally educated people to understand what they have to teach, what they have to share. I think it's absolutely critical now that we're able to co-create in that way, using those kinds of hubs and partnerships. Barefoot has always really looked at how we could partner with different kinds of academic institutions. So 100% open to those partnerships. Please, let's take that offline and have a deeper conversation about that. I think especially in agriculture, we have a lot of opportunity now.
That's great. Really look forward to that. There's a lot of chat going on between Ange and Shinwei. I'd like to bring them in, but just briefly, Jeff, I think when we talked, I made the comment that I was, occasionally have expressed frustration that the STEM agendas are, stuck to so rigidly by policymakers, when it seems like innovation, ideas of how we might reimagine learning are there. And I think you said, well, maybe it's not necessarily the policymakers who block progressive advances. If we do have a sense of how we can, I think there are plenty of ideas in this conversation of how we can radically reimagine learning. Where are the blockages, the systemic blockages? What are your thoughts on that?
This is one of our problems with this conversation. We're talking about so many different things at once, all of which are fascinating, that I find it hard to get my head around with different bits. Maybe just to focus in on two things. One, I've been working quite a bit, as probably some of you, on elder care, residential homes for the elderly, which all over the world have had a pretty tough 10 months. They are places which are a million miles from educational innovation hubs. I've run quite a few of those, and I'm a total fan of that link of art and science and experimentation and discovery of the unknown. Actually, care is a good place to address that. It's partly good because it brings in what Megan was saying, actually the lived experience of people you cannot understand that system unless you involve them. And yet in most parts of the world, they are totally passive, disempowered, not listened to. It's sort of technocratically things are done to them. But equally, you can't understand them without, you know, real respect for deep medical knowledge, which is dramatically better than 20 years ago, the psychological knowledge about what helps people be happy and contented in them. So actually, they are a fantastic place, I think, for all the things we're talking about, because they're one of the systems which isn't working very well in much of the world. More in the, I mean, this is more a sort of rich world problem, perhaps, but China, it's a very big issue at the moment, care of the elderly because of the one-child policy. The thing which I'm really uncertain about, can I share something? I just simply don't know the answer. In a way, it's the last bit of the conversation. Most of the fields I've worked in, practice is way ahead of theory. Almost everything is discovered through people doing stuff, and then 20 years later, some academics catch up with it and try and theorize. It's quite the opposite to the kind of 19th century model of the guru in a university, and then steadily things filter out or are diffused or adopted in the world. In all the fields of sort of social change and politics and so on, the opposite is the case. And yet, it's also clear that in much of life, you know, if you've got a choice between learning, as it were, foundational knowledge, theory at its best, or just an individual context or application, probably you should be spending your time on the foundational knowledge. It's something that Elon Musk said just last week. Always given the choice, he said, I will look for foundational knowledge rather than context knowledge because it's more useful. And probably it depends what you're talking about, what the correct answer is to that question. Again, it's very unwise to generalize. But it does become a choice, because either you devote your scarce time to one or to the other. And so in the different fields I work on, the answers seem to be very different to this such a basic question. Is that someone here got a really good answer?
Anybody? I have some thoughts, but there's no. Oh, Xinwei. Xinwei's got the answer.
I was thinking about the earlier question about fundamental obstacles, and I was struck. Pointing us, drawing attention to the lived conditions, right, of the women who are who have been working in the Barefoot College. I was thinking also of just students in my school, my university in Arizona, in Phoenix, Arizona. ASU is extremely intent on giving opportunities for first-time college-bound Indigenous students, et cetera, to a much greater extent than maybe many of the other colleges in the United States. And the big issue we see is the students are precarious. They're living under such precarious conditions. A lot of them working second jobs, not just to put themselves through college, but to send money back to their families, to put food on the table back at home. So it's more precarious than just a student who has to do student loans. So precarity itself removes energy and attention. And I think some of us are saying that there's no shortcut. I'm saying there's no shortcut. We need people to have space to think, space to amalgamate, space to experiment, right? But that kind of privilege is not there if we're inside an ambient economy. The privilege is speed up, that where profits are based on flux, right? Number of transactions per unit time, whether it's a student or a widget, right? So there are, I think, conditions that are outside the scope of this conversation, which in good complex adaptive systems thinking should not be considered exogenous to our conversation.
Right. Chaba, you want to come in? Oh, yep. Are you there? You frozen? Yeah. Oh, you're back. Yep.
No, I'm back. Just one point that I think goes back to the same idea. I think that either foundational or context or contextual knowledge. I think again we have to have multiple pathways, because we will have different situations. We cannot arrive at one particular kind of best solution of how we go about it. Well, we have to create these frameworks and pathways through which there will be individual paths. So it is really rather, again, building an enabling infrastructure, and which kind of helps us really make use of who we are and create our own paths in a way that have these certain criteria that you have to balance. knowledge and application, real life and theory and all of these things. But those can happen in a number of ways, really. So coming from a place where everything was predefined and you didn't really have to make choices, then again, that was, probably easier, also limiting. We have to somehow move to a different place, which is rather a framework as opposed to a roadmap, I think.
Yeah, great comment. I mean, if I just make a comment myself as well, I'm actually, I think, going to refer to a Nesta paper, Jeff. I think there was a paper, Reinventing the Civic University, a number of years ago, which was very influential. I certainly found it very interesting. It spoke to me about universities becoming more porous and drawing in and drawing from multiple sources. And I suppose I think about that when I've worked on sort of trying to reimagine schools. And, for a lot of years, there's a lot of discussion, still is, about what active citizenship might mean. And I think the porosity of the institutions can help with that, where we're instead of saying, well, this is the place where learning happens and work's over there. And, universities are just for this abstract, kind of knowledge that might not have any application. The more we make all of these different sites of different kinds of learning porous and connected, I think, and I think it does speak to your, multiple forms of knowing, Chaba. And I think what we were speaking about, Megan, is as well the sort of global north and the global south learning together and feeding in different perspectives. I think it does, may I also speak to some of the conversation which I've had with a couple of you about Aristotle's four causes, where, a system to help you avoid settling into privileging one way. For Aristotle, privileging of the efficiency cause, which I suspect Elon Musk falls into, but anyway, that would be another debate. Yeah, but we tried to solve the problems of the world here, obviously, and we only had 90 minutes. We might not have got there, but there's been some really great ideas and questions. We have a few minutes left. I'll check the chat, but can I just invite each of you just to perhaps come back with a minute, just of where your thoughts have got to in this conversation. Any takers? Shaba, you coming in? Your final comments?
Happy to go. There's actually one thing that came to me, which was really about the differentiation that we've arrived at between arts and what we started calling artfulness, which is really the unique way through how you can engage with the world and ourselves through arts, right? With all those unique qualities of reconciling opposites, exercising moral imagination. I mean, we could go on, and that is not always necessarily present in what we call arts, but it could be present in various fields, from science to governance to business, and I think in many ways that, to me, it is a hugely important concept, because that could democratize really the approach that arts could contribute to education and the world, if we make that subtle distinction. And I hope we'll do.
Great, thanks, Chaba. Megan, looks like you're ready.
Oh, I'm gonna end with Tagore, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into narrow domestic walls, where words come out of the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. I think it's just such a nice spirit to where we all need to ensure that we head with our ideas about education and inclusivity and justice.
Absolutely. I think it's a great contribution, and I think it speaks to a number of the questions that have been coming in. in the chat. So thanks for that, Megan. Anybody else want to come in with a, we're down to about 60 seconds, so you're going to have to be quick. Jeff, and then Ange.
Well, Tagore was the inspiration of the Open University, which is our biggest educational institution here in the UK. Just two comments which are both and thinking. The crucial fact of the Anthropocene is we live at the moment in the very best time ever in terms of health, education, security, prosperity, of all time, and yet also a time of incredible fragility. You've got to have both in mind at the same time. And similarly, our education has to be respectful of the depth of knowledge of physics, biology, but also sociology and other things which people have worked so hard on, but also from an early age, link those together, connect them to ethics, connect them to the bigger view. And we've got to fight against singular mono views, whether they appear progressive or reactionary.
Love it. Yep. Ange, we may be out of time, but if you want to squeeze some comments in, that would be great.
Kids born in 2021 will be adults by 2040, and maybe it would be too late for the Anthropocene. So we have a lot of work to do. So just go to work.
I agree that urgent and deep learning is required. Oh, you've shared a screen, Xinwei. Yep.
Yes, that's my final comment. So
okay.
It's about invite people to come and talk about this.
I think we're out of time, to be honest, but just in case we're not, Gediminas or did you have anything to close with?
I'm just happy, to say, comment as, Stafford Beer was looking at a complex system. He got his inspiration in the pond or in the swamp, and that was his inspiration to design the supercomputer, So I'm thinking of the idea of the pragmatic fiction, where the work of art engages in solving the challenges of life, environment, or science, and offers a fiction, undiscovered connection, new materials, or new technology.
Great. I just want to thank everybody. Really a lively conversation and very stimulating. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope our audience enjoyed it. But thanks very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you again on another call soon, I hope.
Thank you. Thank you all.